Morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Hope the ice didn't hinder a whole lot of people. If you look in the parking lot and there's big clumps of salt in random places, that's from me salting the parking lot this morning. We have a salt spreader and it works pretty good except when you got the big clumps of salt in there. So that came from me taking those big clumps and throwing them on the ground trying to break them up. Of course, then they're on the ground and I can't do anything with them, so that did me a lot of good. We're going to begin Matthew chapter 14 today. I say begin. I'd like to go faster, but there's just so much in here to unpack. And so we're going to cover the first 12 verses of Matthew 14 today, if I get through all of my material. And so this section that we're looking at today, as we continue in the Gospel of Matthew, we're in a big chunk of narrative. And it tells the story, this section does, of the death of John the Baptist. John the Baptist has been mostly absent after chapter 4, after chapter 3, after Jesus is baptized by John in the River Jordan. He's been mostly absent. There was a little period before where John's disciples come and ask Jesus a question. But for the most part, John has kind of taken a back seat, and it reminds me of what he says in John chapter 3 and verse 30, where he says, "He must increase," speaking of Jesus, "and I must decrease." And what that shows us is that John sort of takes a back seat and lets Jesus become the center of attention. And in Matthew's gospel account, that's exactly what's been happening. Jesus has been the center of attention, which is why it seems odd for Matthew to sort of interrupt the flow of this narrative about Jesus, with Jesus as the focal point, to now focus on John the Baptist's death. And it makes you wonder a couple of questions. One thing would be, why talk about this at all? This is the gospel of Jesus, right? That's what Matthew is recording for. So why talk about John the Baptist's death? Because John, he was the forerunner for Jesus, and now Jesus is fully in the picture, and so we thought the forerunner's job was done. Well, as we're going to find out, his job actually was not done yet. It's going to be completed here today. And then the other question is, why is it that Matthew talks about this now? Because if you've noticed with Matthew, and I think he does this at least as much, if not more so, than the other gospel writers, he's very intentional with what he includes and with what he doesn't. And he's even intentional with phrasing things just a little bit differently. And I haven't drawn much attention to some of that, but when you compare things that are recorded in 2 or 3 or all 4 of the same gospel accounts, they tell the same story, but sometimes they're worded a little differently. Matthew's very intentional with the way that he phrases things, whether it's to allude to some sort of typology within the Jewish faith or, whatever else it might be. So it seems odd for Matthew to interrupt the flow of thought with following what Jesus has been doing to now talk about John the Baptist. And so why talk about this at all? And why talk about it now? Why talk about it here in chapter 14 after what we've been studying? There's a few factors as to why Matthew talks about this, and in particular why he talks about this at this moment in time. One thing that's obvious is this is reliable history. If you read some of what scholars say about what we read, they put a lot of things into question, but when you dive deep, it really lines up with some of the secular history, whether it's mentioning Herod the Tetrarch, that's something that Matthew is intentional about, or the names of people involved and so on and so forth. These are things that line up with Josephus's historical account. They credit Josephus, he was a Jewish historian. They credit Josephus as being pretty reliable. Well, what Matthew says lines up with what Josephus said. And so this is, of course, reliable history. Another thing, we've seen this as we've been going through Matthew's gospel account, and in particular in chapter 13 with the parables, and then with the conclusion of that chapter when Jesus is rejected in Nazareth. This sort of follows the thread of rejection and persecution that Jesus has been talking about, and we'll look at some of that as we go through. But this is the big one that we're going to look at in some more detail in a little while. This foreshadows Jesus' death, which, as we're going through Matthew's gospel account, we're roughly getting to the halfway point. We're not quite there yet, but we're inching closer. And as we inch closer to that, we're inching closer to the death of Jesus, which is, of course, the climax of any gospel account, but certainly Matthew's gospel account. So with that in mind, let's read verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. So we see at that time, this marks a transition. This is one of the things that's characteristic of Matthew's gospel in comparison to other ones. Some would look at this perhaps as a timestamp, and it functions that way. But for Matthew, it's more or less transitioning from one story to the other. And that's what we see happening here. In terms of the timestamp involved in this, keep in mind what this comes after, and it's coming after Matthew chapter 13. Jesus gives the parables of the kingdom, and then he's rejected at Nazareth. And so this is still pertaining to about that same time when Jesus is rejected in his hometown. And so that idea of rejection is fresh on the minds of Matthew's readers, and I think Matthew is intentional behind that. So it's at this time, and he mentions Herod the Tetrarch. Now, it can be kind of confusing because there's a few different Herods in the New Testament. There's Herod the Great, which we already read about at the beginning of Matthew's gospel account. He's the baby killer, the one that tried to kill all the male-born babies at that time. There is Herod Antipas, which is this Herod. There's Herod Agrippa when you get to the book of Acts. There's a lot of different Herods. Herod is more of a title than a name, or perhaps maybe more of a family name, if anything. And so the Herod that we're talking about here is Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas is the son of Herod the Great. And so Herod the Great, he's called Herod the Great for a reason. He had a reputation, and maybe some of that was him, praising himself a little bit, but he had a lot of good accomplishments in terms of worldly thinking, not in terms of religious thinking, because remember, he's the baby killer from back in chapter 1 and chapter 2. But Herod the Great accomplished a lot of good secular things. And so he's kind of a mixed bag, but he had some good accomplishments along with a lot of the bad things that he did, such as renovating the temple in Jerusalem and so on and so forth. And so Herod Antipas is his son. And so this is the Herod that we're talking about here, Herod Antipas. One other thing that's interesting, if you read in Mark's account, he calls him Herod the King. Matthew calls him Herod the Tetrarch. For once, Matthew is actually the historically accurate one in comparison to some of the other ones. Luke is the one who is the storied historian. He's a physician, right, so on and so forth. Matthew kind of gets a bad rap for the historicity of the things that he writes, but it's Matthew who's actually the most accurate here, calling this Herod a tetrarch, because that's exactly what he was. And so as the story goes, Herod, he's the king of the Jews, Herod the Great. He dies, and what ends up happening eventually is his kingdom, his territory that he was in charge of, it gets divided into three or four different territories, and each one of his sons gets a different part. And so that's where the name Tetrarch comes from. That means, tetra meaning four, so on and so forth. And so he is a tetrarch, meaning he's over a fourth of what was at one time his father's kingdom. And so this kingdom is now divided, and Herod Antipas has roughly a quarter of it. And so Matthew's writing, calling him a tetrarch. And Herod hears of the fame of Jesus. This is one thing we've seen, and it's kind of beginning to exponentially grow, is the fame of Jesus. He's doing these things, and it's becoming so widespread. It's undeniable, the things that Jesus is doing. You could think of him raising Jairus' daughter from the dead. You could think of him calming the storm. You could think of all these things on top of teaching as one with authority and so on. And so his fame is so widespread that even the ruler of that region, even Herod the Tetrarch, even he is hearing of what Jesus is doing. You might think of a ruler like this, and you might think, well, he doesn't have time to listen about something that this lowly person from Nazareth who's just been rejected, these little things that he's doing. But even Herod Antipas gets word of what Jesus has been doing. His fame spreads even to the ruler. Verse 2, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. So once again with Jesus, we see they don't deny the things he's doing. They deny the authority that he does them by. The Pharisees said he does these things by the prince of demons. Well, here, Herod Antipas says, well, this is John the Baptist raised from the dead. That's how he's doing these things. And so this is obviously kind of an interesting thing to look at here. He says that this is John the Baptist raised from the dead. There's a lot of confusion going on here with Herod, and you can understand he's a worldly person. I know he's technically a Jewish king, but he's a worldly person more or less, and he doesn't have any idea what's going on. He thinks, and maybe there's some necromancy sort of things involved here, but he thinks that because Jesus is able to do these mighty works, he's just a resurrected John the Baptist. And it's kind of interesting. This implies that John the Baptist is now dead. And so this is actually Matthew's way of telling us that John has died. So this is the first time in Matthew's gospel that we see John being dead. And we'll read of the circumstances of his death in a moment. But here's Matthew's way of telling us that John is, of course, dead. And so he says, this is John the Baptist. He's raised from the dead. This is why he's able to do these miraculous powers. That's a really wild claim. And you can't help but wonder why. Why in the world would Herod make such an outlandish claim? Maybe there's belief in necromancy. That was a pretty common thing back at that time. You could even go as far back as during the time of David and Samuel, the things that Saul did, so on and so forth. Maybe he's just a little superstitious. Like Michael Scott says, he's not superstitious, but he's a little stitious. Maybe there's some of that going on. I certainly see a lot of paranoia going on in here. Maybe I'm reading into that, but I think Herod is certainly paranoid. He knows, like we'll read in a moment, he wrongfully had someone put to death, and so maybe now he feels bad about that. Maybe he feels like he's going to be haunted or something like that. So you see the paranoia, you see the confusion, you see what's the word I'm looking for? The ignorance here with what is going on. Herod gets wind of these things that Jesus is doing. He thinks it's some resurrected John the Baptist type person. And so now, as we get into verse 3 and following, we're going to see the circumstances of John's death. It says, "For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife." And so now we move into flashback mode. John is already dead, and now Matthew is telling us how this death happens. So we're talking about something that's happened in the past. And what we see happen here initially is Herod Antipas has put John in prison. And this is perhaps what we read of happening in chapter 4 and verse 12. You remember, this is after the temptation of Jesus in the Judean wilderness. And it says that John was thrown in prison, and so Jesus withdraws from there. That's when Jesus goes to the region of Galilee in the first place, which at this point in time Jesus is still there. And so perhaps that's what happens in chapter 4 and verse 12. It's possible John was also a repeat offender, so maybe he was in prison multiple times. We don't really know. But we do see him in chapter 4 and verse 12 get thrown in prison. So maybe that's what happens there. And we see the reason why. Or maybe not the reason, but we see the circumstance behind it. There's really no good reason. But we see it's for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And so what happens here is John has made an enemy of this woman, Herodias. It's for her sake, is what Matthew says, that John is in prison. And so somehow, some way, and we'll see why, somehow, some way, John has made this woman mad. She arranges for him to be thrown in prison. And if you're just reading this for the first time and you aren't aware of the circumstances, you could see sort of how this is going on. Okay, this would be Herod's sister-in-law. It's his brother Philip's wife. And so somehow, some way, John angered one of Herod's family members, and so that's what happened. Well, there's actually much more going on than that, and it's quite a messed up situation. Bert Kaufman put it this way, speaking of Herodias, where he says, "An evil influence can sometimes be exerted by an unprincipled woman in a high place." Now notice it's not just any woman in a high place, but it's an unprincipled one. There's a woman in a high place who doesn't deserve to be there. This would apply to men also. Someone there who doesn't deserve to be there. They're just there by happenstance. And you made someone mad, and then all of this goes down with it. And you see the destruction that can come from that. When people jockey for position and they're not where they're supposed to be, and so on and so forth. And so John has made this woman Herodias mad. Herod throws him in prison, and we'll see what John did to make her mad. Because John had been saying to him, speaking of Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have her." So now we see what's really going on. There's a lot of messed up things going on, and John is simply calling it out, and he gets punished for it, is what happens here. And so the real issue here is John is calling them out. In particular, it says he's addressing Herod, calling them out for being in an unlawful relationship. It's a relationship that is not supposed to be happening, where you have a man who is with his brother's wife. This is a really messed up situation. One that at the time, and Josephus talks about this, and other historians talk about it as well, this was a highly controversial relationship. It wasn't just John that was speaking out against this. Other Jewish leaders did this as well, because this blatantly violates the Jewish law, in particular thinking about having your brother's wife. The only circumstance where that would be allowed is if the brother passes and the widow is left without children. There was a circumstance where that was permitted, but that doesn't apply here. History tells us that. And so this relationship, it was highly controversial. It's a messed up thing that no one would want to be part of, but especially a Jewish ruler, especially someone who's in charge of Jewish people. Because it'd be one thing if you were in a pagan area and anything goes sort of thing. But keep in mind, this is a Jewish area over a Jewish territory with Jewish subjects. They knew that this was wrong. And so you can imagine Herod Antipas, his popularity was certainly very low. His approval rating would have been down in the tank if they kept those polls back then. I don't know if they had people doing that or not. But this was a highly controversial and highly scandalous relationship, especially for a Jewish ruler, because that was a no-go for the Jewish people. And what we see happening here, there's this unlawful relationship, and John, it seems, was pretty relentless in telling them about it. There's a lot you could admire about John because of this. He's speaking the truth, and he's not afraid of the consequences. One thing that's interesting, when you look, you don't need to know Greek a whole lot, but sometimes when you know Greek, and you don't even have to know it, but you just need to be able to read the right stuff. If you've got a Greek handbook like I've got, the name of it literally is It's Still Greek to Me. They take a play on the pun there. But this helps because it enriches the meaning a little bit. The verb that's used, that is translated in my Bible as had been saying, that's all one word in the Greek, that is in the imperfect tense in the Greek. And what that implies here is that this is an ongoing and continuous thing that John did. This wasn't just a one-time thing that John said. This is something that he probably told him over and over and over again, poking the bear until eventually he gets thrown in prison. And so you can kind of see it in how it's translated in English. It's an ongoing, it's a progressive sort of thing. That's why instead of saying John said, he had been saying. It's an ongoing thing. And so what we see happening here, connecting the dots with what we've already seen in Matthew's gospel account, is you've got persecution here for proclaiming the truth. John brings to attention this scandalous relationship that shouldn't have been happening. He gets persecuted for it. I think of what Jesus says in Matthew 5, verses 10 and 12, where that's where he talks about, blessed are you, right? It's a blessing when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. And blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things against you and so on and so forth. And then in chapter 10, this is when Jesus is addressing the 12. And he talks about, I'll read a little bit from that, from Matthew chapter 10, where he says, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you'll be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, and so on and so forth. He speaks about the persecution that they are going to endure. Now, remember, this is addressed specifically to the 12, but the principle that applied to the 12, we see it happening with John as well. He's being persecuted for righteousness' sake. He's drawing attention to this illicit relationship, And he gets persecuted for it. And ultimately, he's going to actually be killed for it. Verse 5 says, "And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet." And so we see sort of how this is shaping out. John is repeatedly saying, hey, it's unlawful for you to have her, it's unlawful for you to have her, repeatedly over and over again. He gets thrown in prison, but we see that Herod actually wants to kill John. He wants to put John to death. And as the king, he has the authority to do this. That's not a great thing. And it's technically illegal to do so without a trial under Jewish law. But he could have done it if he really wanted to, and ultimately he does. But he wants to put him to death. And you can understand why. It's wrong for him to want to do that. But you can understand why. Because John is sort of being a thorn in his side. But for good reason, right? And so Antipas, you can understand, wants to put him to death. And it makes you question, thinking about internally with us, when someone calls out a sin that we're committing, how do we respond? Are we going to lash out at the messenger? Do we have to do some things like Nathan does with David, where he kind of disguises it in a parable, and then, like Nathan does, he turns it on David, to where David has no other choice but to come to grips with what he's done, that sort of thing? How do we respond when our sin is called out? I hope that we respond a little better than Herod does. Something to think about for ourselves. Another thing we see with this, Herod feared the people. He wants to put John to death, but he doesn't do so, at least not at this moment, because he feared the people. In other words, he's afraid of what the people are going to do in response. And keep in mind, his popularity was probably in the tank because of this relationship he's in, also because of some of the things his father had done. Now he's kind of the heir to that. And so he's kind of got to stay in good graces with the people. And keep in mind, they're under Roman control as well. The Pax Romana was a big deal for the Roman people. They had the sort of peace through strength sort of thing, under an iron fist type thing. And so if there's any uprisings, then Herod would be in big trouble at the hand of the Romans. And so he's got to keep peace here a little bit. And so out of fear over what the people will do, he doesn't initially put John to death. And it makes you wonder, what kind of a leader fears his people? This is showing us the kind of person that Herod is. He's already in an illicit relationship. Now he's being portrayed in sort of a weak-spined kind of a way, where he's fearing what his people will do. You can understand why, but what kind of a leader does that? Not a good one. And you can see that in the fruit with what he does. And we see again the reason why. It's because they held him to be a prophet. They believed John was a prophet. In fact, he was a prophet. Jesus says he's the Elijah that was to come. And you got to remember, Herod was already unpopular. And so he didn't need this on his record as well. So for now, he's just trying to maintain the peace. But then something rather strange happens. And this story is one I couldn't help but laugh reading how commentators tried to describe this. One would just deny that it even happened. Another would say, oh yeah, Herod was a messed up person. Some are in the middle. It's just kind of funny how they're so divided over this. And you can understand why, because this is a really strange thing. So this is verses 6 and 7. It says, "But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias," and keep in mind, Herodias is the woman that he shouldn't be having, "the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask." So Herodias' daughter, this may or may not have been Herod's niece, depending on who the father of this daughter is. If it's his brother, then it would be his niece. And they were only half-brothers, so it would be like a half-niece kind of thing. They're still related, so it's still really strange. And so the daughter of Herodias is dancing. So he's having this birthday party. She comes out and dances. Matthew intentionally leaves out language, but you can imply that this is a lewd and perverted sort of dance, just based on the custom of that time. And this sort of thing, maybe not necessarily the lewd dances, but the idea of someone coming and pleasing the king before his company was a common thing. And you can see this happening a few times in the book of Esther, for example. Esther 2 and verse 9 is one example of that. Not necessarily the dancing type thing, but the idea of someone coming and pleasing the king is something that happens. And so he likes this a little too much. And what happens is he starts talking a little too much. He promises with an oath to give her whatever she asks. And so what we see happening here is Herod starts talking a big game. And you can compare this with Esther chapter 5, where a similar thing happens, where there in Esther the king says, I'll give you even a portion of my kingdom. So this is also a common thing that happens. He promises to give her whatever she asks. Well, they say be careful what you wish for. In this case, be careful what you promise to somebody, because Herod is not ready for what this girl is going to ask. Prompted by her mother, keep in mind, her mother hates John. It's the reason he's in prison in the first place. She said, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. And so we see that initially she's prompted by her mother. This woman, Herodias, is the reason that John's in the prison in the first place. We see that in verse 3. It's because of her that he is in this predicament in the first place. And now she's prompting her daughter for what Antipas is going to do. And so you wonder, well, what could it be? She hates John. Herod will do whatever she wants. So what in the world could she ask for? She says, give me John's head on a platter. That's what she asked for, which of course implies his death by beheading, which you don't see a lot of in the Bible. You don't see that very often. It was kind of a shameful way to kill someone, a shameful way to die. You don't see it very often. We see it here. And this is, of course, predictable. If Herodias is the one who gets to get what she wants, she's going to want John dead. And we see a really interesting response from Herod. The king was sorry. In Mark's account, it says he was exceedingly sorrowful, I believe. The king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. So this raises the question, well, why in the world would Antipas be sorry about this? We read before that he wanted to kill John. So why is he sorry? Well, maybe he realizes, okay, I'm not going to be able to keep the peace anymore. Maybe he didn't want to displease his people, or maybe he might have actually enjoyed John's company. We kind of see that implied in Mark 6 and verse 20. I don't think I put that in my PowerPoint, so I'll read it to you. It says, let's see, starting in verse 19 of Mark 6, Herodias had a grudge against him being John, and wanted to put him to death, but she could not, for Herod feared John. So this is before all of this happens. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. So this is more, as Mark records it, it's more than just Herod not killing him. He actually kept him safe. And he goes on to say, when he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. So as Mark records it, Herod actually kind of liked hearing John, even if he's speaking against him. He actually kind of enjoyed hearing him. There's a little back and forth here that Herod seemed to enjoy. So maybe he actually liked John and he really didn't want to kill him. But we saw before that he did want to kill him. He was just afraid of the repercussions of that. Now he's going to have to deal with it because, like they say, you make your bed, you got to lie in it. And so we see that because of the oaths that he made, which notice the plural of that, it's oaths, not just an oath. But he made these oaths, and he did so in front of his guests. Now he's got to follow through with it. And so, like I said, you made your bed, you got to lie in it. Herod did this to himself. He talked a big game, and not just talking the big game, but he did so in front of his friends. And so now he knows he's got to follow through with this, not just because he said he would, right? Because typically it's honorable to keep the oaths that you take, but also because he doesn't want to embarrass himself in front of his friends. And so this really leaves him no choice. And so he commanded it to be given. You can kind of read into this, because he's sorry, he sort of begrudgingly gives this command. Have you ever had to do something you don't want to do, but you know you have to do it? That's the situation that Herod is in. He doesn't want to kill John, but he knows because of the situation he has to do it. And so that's what happens. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. So we see again, John is killed. He's beheaded in prison. And what we see happening here, perhaps as we're going through this, you can see some of the foreshadowing. He's executed in a shameful way. There's not much that's more shameful than being beheaded. He's executed in a shameful way, and he dies as if he's a criminal. Because keep in mind, he's beheaded in prison. He's beheaded as if he was a criminal, as if he had done something warranting the death penalty, and yet, no trial, nothing of that nature. He's beheaded in prison. He dies this shameful death. And his head is brought on a platter, and it's given to the girl. And so his head is displayed almost like a trophy. And this was fairly commonplace in that period of time. And in fact, you can even see it going back to 1 Samuel 17 with the death of Goliath, where after Goliath is killed, David takes his head, right? And he kind of displays it as a trophy. Well, we see the same thing happen here somewhat with John the Baptist, where his head is put on a silver platter. Here you go. Here's the head that you wanted. And of course, she brings it to her mother. And this would have made her mother very happy. And then we come to the end. His disciples came and took the body and buried it. And they went and they told Jesus. We've seen John's disciples before. They came and they asked Jesus about why, I think it's about why his disciples didn't fast. I think that's what that question was. Now they come again, except now they have to bury their teacher. And so they're left to tend to their teacher's body. We don't know if John had any other family. We assume he didn't. Now they have no teacher. Well, you hope happens is Jesus will fill that void for them. And we see that they do go and they tell Jesus what happens, which will segue into the next section. But for now, let's look at what we see here with John the Baptist's death. One thing we see here, sort of connecting the dots with where we are in Matthew, with what we've seen, with what Matthew has been bringing to our attention, one thing that stands out is John's death and the circumstances around it. It shows the natural results of when you reject Jesus. So when you accept Jesus, you bear the fruit of the Spirit, right? Like Paul talks about in Galatians 5, love and joy and peace and patience and so on and so forth. But what happens when you reject Jesus? You get into some of that work of the flesh, and we see some of it shaping out here in this section. One thing you see is misunderstanding. Herod hears about Jesus. He hears about these mighty works he's doing, things that you can't deny that he was really doing, such as raising people from the dead or casting out demons or healing people or calming storms or what have you. He's going to walk on water pretty soon. That's another one. And he attributes it to John the Baptist being raised from the dead. Part of that's paranoia, I think. Part of it is also just simple misunderstanding. If you've rejected Jesus, then you've rejected the truth. Like Jesus says, you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. So you also reject freedom in that sense as well. But we see ignorance and misunderstanding going on here. You see also an unlawful relationship. He's with someone he shouldn't be with. We've got a lot of unlawful relationships in our world today by people who have rejected Jesus. People who are doing things with someone they shouldn't be doing them with. People who are with people they shouldn't be with, so on and so forth. This is something you see a lot of in today's society. You also have wrathful thoughts. You could certainly read into it with Herodias. We see in verse 5 that Herod even wanted to put John to death. He had that desire to do so, but he feared the repercussions of it because he is that spineless leader. You see also the promiscuity. You could kind of read into that with the unlawful relationship, but you also have this, we assume she's a teenager, this teenage girl going around and doing what you can assume is a pretty lewd dance. And so you have promiscuity going on as well. And it ends ultimately with violent opposition. You killed the people that oppose you. This is the fruit of what we see happening with those who reject Jesus. And so if you're Matthew's readers, if you're a Jew and you're reading this, you see, okay, this is what's on one side. Following Jesus is on the other side. You have, the fruit of the Spirit. You see all these other things. This is the fruit you're going to bear if you reject Him. So which would you rather be a part of? Would you rather be part of all of this chaos that's going on, or would you rather have the peace of being in Christ? Of course, the main takeaway I want us to have with John's death, and I think the main thing that Matthew is perhaps drawing to our attention, are the parallels and the foreshadowing and the typology that we see going on here between how John dies and then how Jesus dies. And keep in mind, Matthew has sprinkled in some foreshadowing now and again leading up to the death of Jesus. We're getting a pretty clear picture now of what that is going to look like when it comes to Jesus dying. And so there's a lot of parallels. And this is just some of them. You could probably think of a few more, but this is what I thought of that would fit on a screen. So one thing, they're wrongfully imprisoned. What crime did Jesus commit that led to him getting taken? Exactly. There's not one. Same thing with John. What was he imprisoned for? For preaching righteousness. He's wrongfully imprisoned. That's not a crime. So they're both wrongfully imprisoned, of course. And if you look close at the language that's used, the words are exactly the same that are used, which in the Greek is pretty significant. You read one place, then you read another place, and it makes you think of that place earlier. The language is exactly the same. Thinking of John being seized and then bound, it's exactly what happens to Jesus. They seize him, and then they bound him, and eventually they kill him. That word is the same too, by the way, when they kill him. We see the cause is preaching righteousness. There's a few other things in line with Jesus as well. There's the jealousy of the Jewish leaders and so on and so forth. Part of what made them so jealous is the fact that Jesus did teach with authority. He had authority that they didn't have. So that made them a little upset, I think. And so this is caused by preaching righteousness. John calls out this adulterous and immoral relationship. Jesus preaches righteousness. He preaches the kingdom. They don't like it, so they bind him and kill him. We see also that their demise is plotted and it's conspired. We see that there's a desire for it on the hand of John. Herod wanted to do it. He just feared the repercussions. Herodias certainly wanted it. That's why he was in prison in the first place. And you see the second she gets a chance, she takes it. You can almost wonder if this is something that maybe she's been wanting and been dreaming of for some time, and now she gets a chance and she takes it and she doesn't miss. We know, of course, that Jesus' demise has also been plotted, and in fact, at this point, is already being plotted in Matthew's gospel account. We see also that they're both put to death by reluctant leaders. Herod, he feared what the people were going to do, and so he didn't want to do it. I think that's why he was sorry that he had to do this. He didn't want to do this. And we know, of course, when it comes to Jesus, that Pontius Pilate is quite reluctant. We see once again, he seems kind of spineless in that sense as well. He washes his hands of it and he gives it over to the people. They both also die the lowly death of a criminal. One by decapitation, the other by crucifixion. Both capital ways of being killed, both quite humiliating. I'm not sure which is more humiliating. I would assume crucifixion is, because it's more drawn out and there's more of a spectacle made of it, especially with how they did it with Jesus. But both die humiliating, lowly deaths that were typically reserved for criminals. In this case, it's to people that are wrongfully imprisoned. Speaking of that lowly death, their death was also made into a spectacle. John's head on a silver platter. Jesus publicly hanging on a cross with no clothes, unable to cover himself. You see the pictures and they have some sort of garment over him. I don't think that garment was actually there as it really happened. His nakedness, I think, was seen by all people. It's made into a spectacle. And then finally, in both cases, their bodies are taken and buried by either a disciple in the case of Jesus or John's disciples here. There's probably more you could think of, but this is a good number already. And it's pretty striking, the similarities. I think this is quite intentional on Matthew's part, to the point where there's some things that he actually excludes that Mark includes because it doesn't really fit what he's trying to do. And there might be other things that he reads into it as well. So there are a striking number of parallels between how John dies and the soon-to-come death of Jesus. And so what we see with this, John's death is not just a random occurrence. You might read this and it might seem like it's out of place. You're reading about Jesus, he's just been rejected, all of a sudden John dies. Well, where has John been, and why is it that this happens now? Well, this isn't just random, it's not just happenstance, and it's not out of order either. What we see with this is that John, just as he was before, just as he was in the wilderness preaching about the kingdom, John remains the forerunner of Christ, even to the point of how they die. And Jesus says as much when we come to Matthew 17 and verse 12, where he says, I tell you that Elijah has already come. He's talking about John. Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they pleased. They killed him. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Just as they did to John, they're going to do to Jesus. And this is something that's very important when you look at the fact that they've just rejected him. What this tells us is that their rejection will ultimately lead to Jesus' death, which is, of course, the focal point of this gospel account. Any comments or questions? Garfield?
You go back to the 11th chapter of Matthew and verse 11 where Jesus made this statement about John. He says, no one born of woman is greater than John the Baptist. But those that are least in the kingdom of heaven are greater than he, and that's talking about us.
Right. Yeah, we're the ones in the kingdom. As good as John was, even the least in the kingdom are better.
You made a comment that, I think something along the lines of what would the Jews have thought. And I was thinking, well, if I was a Jew, what would I be thinking? And my thought was, 1 Samuel, chapter, where Saul gives the warning about not having a king. And then also Deuteronomy, because what Saul ends up saying is that the king will end up taking. And then Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6 through 8, if they had just kept the commandments of God, they would have been this great nation.
Yeah, Tom talks about what could have been if the Jews could have just listened to God. You wouldn't have a lot of the things that happened to them, and you wouldn't have some of the messed up circumstances that we read of here.
That being said, though, it wasn't God's plan. God knew they'd fall short, and there would have been no way for the Gentiles to, for God to redeem all mankind. This is just a Jewish nation.
Yeah, God knew that they would fail. That's where Jesus comes in.
Can't help but to think about, I question the intelligence of the leaders that would grant a wish for the pleasing them in one way or another. I mean, without having any kind of limitations as to what that wish might be. I mean, that just makes absolutely no sense to me.
You know why? Because they're not being rational. They're not thinking with their mind. Probably. There are other factors that work with that as well. Steve?
This little stitches, was that from The Office?
Yeah.
Oh,
That was Michael Scott, Steve Carell's person. All right, thanks for your attention.